Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of the Beatitudes. We're going to get into the text, and I just want to read the first two verses today because the setting is important. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Who are the them? The crowds or the disciples? We want to talk a bit as we get into the text of the Beatitudes, and we'll start by looking at the first Beatitude tomorrow, Blessed are the poor in spirit. But this time, let's talk a little bit about, the geometry of the Sermon on the Mount itself. We talked about the fact that Matthew's gospel is a Jewish gospel. It's written to Jewish readers, people with a Jewish background, people who, for whom the genealogies are important and the specific fulfilled prophecies are important, and who don't need to be told what Passover or Day of Atonement means or what the word rabbi means. We don't have any of those explanations in Matthew's gospel because they're not needed. And so the whole setting of the Sermon on the Mount itself is important, and every bit of it is meaningful to his first readers and continues to be for us as well. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus preaches 5 long sermons, and those sermons, the number 5, that's significant, don't you think? I mean, how many books of the law are there? There are 5. So we also mentioned earlier that in every synagogue there was a chair setting up front where the teacher would sit, and that chair was called Moses' seat. And so Jesus is sitting down when he teaches, and so he's assuming the posture of the instructor, the great instructor of Moses. And God had promised that one like Moses would come after, and that prophecy is associated with the Messiah. Moses also, when he brought the law to God's people, went up on the mountain, and Jesus goes up on a mountain, and then begins many chapters of law with a short list that informs everything else. And we call those the 10 Commandments. Those are the things written on tablets of stone by the finger of God himself. And they're a short list of things. And we associate those commands, although only half of them have this phrase, with the phrase, thou shalt not. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do this other either, or things are going to happen to you. But Jesus goes up on the mountain, sits down in Moses' seat, and begins to teach, and he gives them a short list, but not commands, blessings. And yet these blessings are going to make greater demands on them, on their perception, on their willingness to obey, than the 10 Commandments ever did. In fact, they're not going to be meaningful to us at all apart from the sacrifice of Jesus. And yesterday, we talked about the themes that run throughout, that we assume that God is good, that God is in charge. There is this eschatological consciousness that runs throughout, this knowledge that there is an end to things, and that at the end of things, God will be in charge, and we who are his own will be with him. We also noticed that the value of self-sacrifice is the primary value communicated because it is the primary work of Jesus on the earth, to give himself as a sacrifice for us. And if we're his disciples, it will be our primary value as well. And we also saw that there are not only rewards in heaven, but there's reward on earth as well. This is a rewarding life to live, not just then, but it is now. And we see that in these Beatitudes. But let's talk about verses 1 and 2 just briefly. So he's teaching them. Who are the them? Well, there are 2 groups of people that are mentioned. There are the crowds, the polloi, okay, the many. And I think we can extrapolate from the crowds to include the entire human population. Because what Jesus has to teach is germane, necessary to the entire human population, although the entire human population, in fact, the vast majority of humanity will reject the teachings of Jesus. Jesus tells us this in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. But they're there, and Jesus is in the middle of them, and therefore they are responsible for what Jesus communicates. But then from this greater population, there comes to Jesus a smaller subset of humanity, and those are the ones seeking to be his disciples. Those are the ones who are drawn to him and commit themselves to following him, to come out from the crowd to follow Jesus. And that's exactly the setting that's described. And we can think of this geometrically when we think of the meaning of the Sermon on the Mount for the disciple, which I'm assuming all of you, my viewers, are. So we have Jesus as a point in the middle, and then two concentric circles, a larger circle that is the human population, and a smaller circle, which is the subset of people who are believers, who are followers of Christ, and then Jesus is the dot in the middle. And then when we think about this geometrically, it helps to understand our place in this world. We are in the world, but not of it, as Jesus says, and in John 17. And as disciples, we have at the center of all things Jesus. And we are all growing to Jesus, the way plants always grow to the light. If the sun comes in from a skylight in a building, and you place some house plants like my peperomia over there, in the four corners of the room, they will grow towards the center of the room because that's the source of light. And so Jesus is at the center for us, and we're always growing towards him. Paul will say we're growing up to be as tall as Christ, as big as our head in Ephesians chapter 4. And yet, there's a greater circle around us. We're still in the world. And so this sermon is about teaching us to be just those people, people who are living in the context of this world, the greater human population in the sinful world that we have created together, but living lives with Christ at the center. And that's what this sermon is about. And the place we start are the Beatitudes, putting on those blood-colored glasses we talked about so that we can see the world just as it is. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes. We're going to talk about the very first Beatitude, verse 3, Matthew chapter 5. Blessed are the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Thank you. We'll see you next time.